Okay, doing my first one of these in a little while. I have been very busy between my own training, school, and coaching. I promise once I am done with school this coming December, I will return to doing these more regularly because I do still enjoy them absolutely. Just very busy. So if you have any questions you would like my opinion on, leave them in the comments of this video. I appreciate you guys' participation as always. Um, I've heard many times people say that during the deadlift you want to keep the bar in contact with your body, but I've also heard to start with the barbell over your midfoot. So does keep the bar in contact with your body apply throughout the whole lift, even at the bottom, in the starting position before you pull? I'll give you a hint. Both of those things can be done at once. If you have any degree of forward knee travel in your bottom position of your deadlift, the bar can be placed over your midfoot and be in contact with your shin at the same time. The reason you want to put the bar midfoot is because oftentimes, unless you have a very favorable build to deadlift, you will need some degree of forward knee travel to get down to the bar with a neutral spine. Right? A lot of the time people start the bar up against their shin, and when they go to get it to physically get to the bar without their knees traveling forward at all, they have to round over at their middle back, and then they're just in a compromised position. So we started out a little bit in front of us. We let our knees track forward slightly. It's not super excessive. It's not a clean deadlift, but it needs to, just mechanically, especially if you're built worse, you're going to need a little bit more forward knee travel to get down there in a good position. So they're both possible at the same time. I've also felt sometimes when I deadlift, whilst going down with the bar, I feel my knees are in the way. What could this be? Just initiate the negative by pushing your hips back and don't have your forward knee travel until you're reaching the bottom phase of the negative, right? So it's mostly just going to be an RDL till it passes your knee joint, and then you can let your knees return to slightly over the bar. That way the bar path can be straight on the negative just like it is on the concentric. In regards to your own programming, is it normal to be pretty banged up in terms of tendons, CNS fatigue, minor injuries, last 4 weeks of the block, and how much non-acute injury is acceptable in your opinion to keep pushing? Okay, so that's a very good question. Ideally 0, but in practical application, the stronger you get, you're going to get banged up in a peaking phase in the final 4 weeks of a block. It's almost completely unavoidable, but that being said, we shouldn't just come to terms with it and be complacent. We should be actively working to avoid it. Like, why are you getting tendonitis? That one, definitely there's things to address and avoid. Low back pain, we should be addressing each of those and making adjustments from block to block in our habits, in our mobility, in our warm-ups, in our technique. You're like, oh, my biceps fell apart at the end of the prior block. What am I going to do this block to change that? I'm probably bearing too much load in my hands when I'm doing the back squat. So if I take a look at my T-spine mobility, I'm going to take a good look at my external rotation of my shoulder, and I'm going to evaluate my grip width on the squat, and I am going to make a really conscious effort as I enter those later weeks in the peaking phase to keep load out of my hands. Much the same, you're going to apply that to anything. So any reoccurring issue, you shouldn't just be like, oh, it's normal to be banged up at the end of a block. You should be coming up with a plan to fix it. And each block, you implement a plan. You're like, okay, this one worked. I know I need to do this. This one didn't work. I need a new plan. And you ask around for opinions for people who have dealt with those things, and it's all part of honing your individual process, because you should be able to push volume, you should be able to push intensity, obviously not entirely at the same time, but you should be able to push those things to your upper limits without falling apart if you truly have mastered your own personal process, right? So the things you need to do to minimize how banged up you get are going to be different from me, right? So a lot of that is just experience. So I guess that would be my answer. And how much non-acute injury is acceptable in your opinion to keep pushing? A reasonable bit. Sometimes it sucks. Do you think a way to solve excessive flare on a press would be to keep the bar lower on your chest if your grip isn't super wide? Well, I don't know if it's excessive. I would have to see your bench, Logan. I do not know off the top of my head, because there's a couple of things that could be going on. You might want to just widen your grip because you're clearly favoring towards using your pecs a little bit more so than your shoulders and triceps, maybe because they're stronger. So it could be a sign that you're not fully utilizing a strong muscle that you could be utilizing. It could be a sign that you have very poor control of your back. That's pretty common. It could be that you have inadequate, basically, Long story short, instead of doing like extension at the shoulder, you resort to abduction at the shoulder because you have more strength, right, abducting than you do extending, right? So doing some accessory work with your elbows tucked could help because you just lack the strength to press in that way. So it's gonna depend a reasonable amount. What is a good rep slash set to do for shoulder training on the overhead press to get a bigger overhead? It's no different than any other lift. You're going to want to train a variety of rep ranges during hypertrophy phases. It's going to be a little bit higher, or if you do a daily undulating approach during your hypertrophy days sessions within the week, you're going to be doing a little bit more in like that 8 to 12, 6 to 12 range. During strength phases, you can be like 4 to 6 range. During the peaking phase, you can be 1 to 3. I think that shoulder training, a lot of the time people will hyper specialize in those higher rep ranges, and they might actually see some benefit and carry over to other motions if they train like triples a little bit more often. But singles are more of just like an expression thing. I don't think that building your overhead press via a lot of singles is a very tenable approach, especially because you're not going to get a lot of hypertrophy out of that, so it might not be sustainable in the long run. So you might get really good at expressing the amount of base you have in your shoulders, so like how much muscle mass you have, but you're not going to be growing your base alongside that if you're exclusively training the lower rep ranges. And if you don't train and if you train only high reps, you don't train the lower rep ranges, then you're just going to become neurally inefficient, right? Or less neurally efficient than you could be. Is tempo work important? If so, why or why not? Do you ever do tempo work on the squat, bench, and press? I do all the time. I think it is more so than anything else, you're looking at two reasons to do tempo work. The first one is a way to limit loading while still keeping the relative intensity pretty high. So your proximity to failure is going to be higher with a lower load. So maybe you need to manage your fatigue via tempo work and still keep it fairly specific. The other reason is for technique, right? A lot of the time people will dump through and lose control temporarily in a certain range of motion. And if you're never really controlling it, you're not aware that you're dumping it, right? So you want to be in a sustainable position to output force at any given point in your lift, right? And you're not going to know if you're in a good position to output force if you're speeding through them, right? So putting in slow negatives, putting in a pause at the bottom. I only would do light warm-ups with a slow concentric because I think it's teaching a bad habit, but it is a good way to double check if your positions are sustainable and you're in a good position to continually output force into the bar. So I do them in my warm-ups basically every day, and I will do my back down work with a tempo if I feel like my form is not clicking for that day, and I will program that for a lot of the guys I coach as well. What do you do if you stall in your program you were making good progress on? If I was making good progress and I stalled, I would take a very, very, very hard look at my outside the gym factors first. More often than not, if the program is even remotely reasonable, the reason you stalled was not the program. It was either the effort, the way you were applying that effort, or the things that you were doing outside the gym. Sleep, hydration, nutrition, or outside stressors. If you just started a rough semester of school, your total stress spiked, you could be overreaching a little bit, and you're going to see less progression in the gym. Not uncommon. Have you ever coached lifters on gear? If so, how does it change their programming if you have? Yes, I have. I don't think it makes as big of a difference as people think, and I think people totally misunderstand the direction it usually ends up going. You guys can argue with me if you want. I won't reply because I don't like arguing, but I will tell you observationally and talking to a lot of people, usually what happens is the untested guys will handle lower volumes than the natty guys. If you look at elite lifters, that seems to be the case, and there's a couple reasons for this. People will say, oh, well, being on gear increases your ability to recover, so this program is only for guys on gear because the volume is so high, no natural good. Okay, well, what you have to realize is when you're larger, you carry more muscle mass, and you're moving more absolute load, the volume you can handle goes down. That's pretty common. So supers handle less working sets per week than a top 83 kg guy, right? So when someone gets on gear, they become a larger lifter. The absolute loads go up, and usually that's enough to not only negate the added recovery benefits, it's enough to go in the other direction, and they end up doing a lower volume routine because they're lifting higher absolute loads. The other reason you can get away with lifting higher absolute loads at a lower total sets per week is because gear will it'll delay the detraining process. So it takes someone on anabolic steroids more time to detrain than a natural lifter, so that they can spend more time between heavy overloading sessions without getting any detraining effect, so they can come in truly fresh. This is where programs like the Lilly Bridge method come into play, where you're only squatting heavy every other week and you're only deadlifting heavy every other week. When you have that delayed detraining effect, you can absolutely get away with that, and that is a very tenable way to train. But that being said, you have to be moving very large tonnages to justify that low of a frequency. But if we're looking at normal sized people, the people I coach, I think that it usually ends up canceling out, right? Because the guys have, to some degree, added recovery capabilities, but they're also going to be stronger. So I would say the considerations are more so just based on the total tonnage, right? So if I see a guy who is squatting 650, that's what I look at. I look at the fact that he's squatting 650. I look at his aerobic capacity. I look at how well he's recovering between workouts. Does it factor in? Yes. Is it as predictable as people like to make it sound? No, absolutely not. Like I said, you can really observationally look, and you look who's handling the highest training volumes. It's actually the tested lifters, because they're super advanced, so their work capacity is insanely high, and their absolute loads they're moving are slightly less than their untested counterparts, right? So they're going to be able to handle a higher loading frequency. And then what do you think is a good heart range for powerlifters? Do you think it's important to keep a certain range, and what is yours? I'm assuming you mean resting heart rate, unless you mean like heart rate range for cardio. So I'll just answer both. My resting heart rate is about 63, which I think is very tenable. I think that's a decent range. I would like it to be a little lower, but I am fairly heavy, so I will take my win. I think powerlifters should hold themselves to the same standards that we expect general populations to be held to, because they're not elite athletes. And if you can say, hey, you should probably have your resting heart rate around 60 to someone who barely exercises, we can aim for that too. And if you mean heart rate range for cardio, it depends if you're doing steady state or you're doing HIIT intervals. If you are doing steady state cardio, generally I just 130 to 140, right, for whatever duration you're looking at. If you're doing HIIT, I usually climb my heart rate up to about 150, 160, sustain that briefly, let it come back down, and I chase that rough range, and I do whatever work load is necessary to reach that heart rate range. That's all the questions. I hope they were helpful. Let me know if you have any more.